Hi there. Welcome back to the podcast. And I hope that wherever you are today, I hope that you're having a wonderful day. And so today I'm going to do virtually a re recording of this podcast episode. The one that I had originally posted, the audio was pretty bad as a result of some issues that I had. So, it just, there's not a ton of listeners to this podcast, but the fact of the matter is that you just quality matters, right? And doing things to the best of your ability. And even though it's a hobby, I just want to do it well. So, that's enough of a sob story on my part. But the point is that I wanted to re-record this just so that the audio is good enough to where if anybody what does have a listen to it, that it's a much more enjoyable listen rather than kind of navigating the nonsense that I had on the original recording. So again, this is an episode that I have a very strong love of history, and I think it's very fascinating. There's a myriad of reasons for that, but the point is that in our culture, it has become it's more exploded onto the scene. I think just through alternative media and the means for people to be able to convey what they think to a broader audience. And so, in that light, I think that the academic approach to looking at the past versus the alternative approach to looking at the past has really kind of risen to the fore in some areas, in certain circles, for people to observe and to see and to listen to and to hear kind of both sides of the story. A good example of that would be the Joe Rogan podcast and the interview he did, or not the interview, but the debate that I can call it moderated, but hosted between an academic and Flint Dibble and between an alternative approach in looking at the past and an individual named Graham Hancock. And, the reality of those two, sitting together, it is it is a significant event that typically on the academic side of the house, you're not going to see a lot of credence given to the alternative approach. You're not going to see interaction like that because in doing so, it almost gives a sense of validity to the alternative approach. And there's a lot of nuances to that you could dig into. But the point is that typically these two approaches don't find themselves intermingling. So the fact that there was a, debate between the two is a relatively significant event. Now, the reasons for that are not healthy. The academic in Flynn Dibble, he didn't go on to debate Graham Hancock because he was just excited to present a different perspective and to hear a different perspective and to have a good conversation. It was virtually his response to what he considered to be a dangerous narrative, and we'll get into that later. But the point is that I think it personally just thought it reached a point to where I thought it would be interesting enough, maybe just to do some self study, maybe just to kind of understand a brief history of the academic approach as we understand and know it today, where it came from, but also the alternative approach. And, what were some of the historical things that influenced it as it came up to what we know of and see today. And I just figured it would be just an interesting thing to research a little bit. So my goal today is just to present those things that I have learned. And then on the back end of that, give my opinion with some strengths and weaknesses of each approach. And then uh, just kind of some closing remarks on my end. But the point is for this podcast is to give a fair and as much as I can unbiased perspective of each approach, and then just to let anybody who might have a listen to, take some of that information and make a decision for yourself. And so that's kind of the goal of what I want to do today. So if you've taken the time to have a stop by and have a listen today, thank you. And again, like I said earlier, I hope that wherever you are today, you're having a wonderful day. And I look forward to talking more about this on the other side of the introduction. Thanks.
What is your worldview? How does that worldview shape and form your understanding of meaning? In this podcast, we discuss various matters of interest and value. But in the end, we want to know the deeper meaning of these matters and how they apply to the world around us and to ourselves. My name's Jonathan. Join me as I search out deeper meaning and understanding into the matters at hand.
Before I get into the history of each, I wanted to just kind of, present this question as kind of a precursor to everything else, which is why walk the road at all? The title of this episode is Two Roads to the Past. And it's like, why walk the road at all? Why does it even matter? Why is it even worth the time? And, for me, I'm just going to give a very brief synopsis as to why I think it's worth the time. So first and foremost, I love history, and I think that history provides a perspective that I think is healthy. I think that inside of that perspective, there's a lot of gratitude and contentment to be found because the reality is that no matter what we face in our lives, more than likely somebody else has gone before us that already faced it. And obviously, and in a lot of those cases, there might be examples of people who have gone through it or have gone through things that really when you think about it from a perspective point of view, it makes what we're going through look like nothing compared to the level of intensity of the difficulties, the challenges, the sufferings that they had to endure. So I think in that light, I think that perspective is a really wonderful thing because it can breed gratitude. You can look at, the past and think to myself, man, what I'm going through right now is brutal. But I know that somebody else looking at the past and what I understand from a historical perspective, this is not a path that has not been trodden before. And it's actually been trodden by people who went through much, much worse. And so even though I'm in the thick of it, even though this doesn't make it any easier on my end, and it's not meant to demean anybody who's going through something by saying, oh, well, what you're going through is not bad because other people have been there before. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it can present, instead of a negative, woe is me perspective on looking at the situation of my life, I can look at it with an element of maybe gratitude and maybe a sense of contentment of like, hey, this sucks. But you know what? There's far, far worse that has happened to people in the past. Obviously, you can apply that same idea to the modern day because, I live in a first world country where the problems that I face on a daily basis are absolutely and unequivocally nothing compared to other people in certain places in the world. And so, in that light, there's gratitude, there's contentment, there's like, hey, yeah, this sucks, this is hard, but guess what? It could be much, much worse. And so I think that history presents that element of perspective, which in turn can give weight to gratitude and contentment. So that's a reason that it's worth walking down that road. Um, Next is just general interest. I think these two ways, in essence, are kind of mere reflections of the two different roads that we're going to talk about. So the first is going to be the practical realities of the past. I think about, I have kids right now that are under 5. And I just think to myself about how many diapers have I changed in the last 5 years? And I think to myself, what about in the ancient world? What did they do for diapers back then? What did they do for their kids? And it's like, if you don't have diapers, you don't have the means to dispose. Did they have to wash the cloth that the kids were wearing every single time they went to the bathroom? I mean, there's times where I've changed my daughter's or my son's diapers, 3 to 5 times in a single day. And so that's a very practical reality of like, hey, they still had to navigate these things in the past. How did they do that? What were the means by which they did this? You can apply it to things such as what they wore, how they stayed warm, how they stayed cool, depending on the environment they were living in. How did they make their clothes? I think about the Viking Age. How did they weave those giant sails on their ships together? How did they even go about making those things? You think about silk and all those things in the East, and how did they do that? How did they color things? Like all of these different realities of the past, and I just think it's so fascinating to learn about them. And that's a great example of this scientific means by which the academic side approaches the past, the field specific methods that they have, that they're able to look at these things and bring answers to these questions. And so that's a huge benefit to the academic side, obviously, but also that's one of the practical realities that I think that this path is worth walking down. And then next is imagination. The people that lived in the past, they weren't drones walking around doing only practical things. They would have made impractical decisions. They would have done dumb things for the sake of it just being dumb and because it's funny and because there was a group of them that were drunk and they were being weird and they just decided to do something stupid. And so you have to apply imagination to the past. You have to apply wonder to the past. You have to apply the fact that these people believed in deities, almost all of them. The idea of modern day rationalistic, naturalistic atheism, it was a very, very rare thing in the past. However, there still would have been atheists in the past, people who, kind of went through the motions from a theistic perspective in the past, but they didn't truly believe in a God. So like those same nuances that we have today existed then. But the fact of the matter is that you have to apply imagination to the past. You have to look at things outside of the lens of just the scientific method because you will not catch the whole. So I think that looking at the things in the past with imagination is also something that I think makes this worthwhile to think about and to consider. And lastly, is that this point, and I'm not trying to play peacemaker between the two different approaches on this, right? I mean, the venom between the academic and the alternative approach goes back hundreds of years of animosity between these two different ways of looking at the past. That's not my point. The point is that nobody has a monopoly on the past. The alternative approach does not have a full understanding of what's going on, and the academic side doesn't have a full understanding of what's going on. So nobody has a monopoly. Nobody has a foundation to stand on that puts them in a position to nullify the perspective of other people, and it doesn't put them in a position to demean the other perspective. But there should be a common ground that all of us have when we do consider the past. And that common ground, in my opinion, is that we should all be humbled by the magnitude of history, by the weight of history, by the amount of souls that have gone before us in the past. All of these realities should just be so humbling for all of us. And regardless of how you look at and consider the past, I think that everybody should be able to find common ground in that element of humility. And so those would be some examples as to why I think this path is worth walking. So what I want to do now is I want to preface historical component and everything else that follows with this. The dichotomies and approach of the academic versus the alternative perspective are pretty obvious. My goal in this in demonstrating laying out these different perspectives, my goal is to present this question of, hey, do you think that there's value in only one approach? Do you think that there's value in both approaches? Do you think that there's a balance to be found, or do you think there is no balance to be found? So, as we go through the history of each of these approaches, as we go through some of the core principles of these approaches and what I consider to be strengths and weaknesses, how would you answer that question? How would you disagree or agree with me in my approach? If you're somebody who thinks from an alternative perspective, how do you view the entirety of the academic approach, not just the approach, but the people that make up that approach that are actually, carrying it out? Do you think that they're all cynics? Do you think that they're all, out to get anybody who looks at it a different way? Or do you think that there's a balance? If you're an academic and you're looking at it from an academic approach, do you think that every single person that approaches things from an alternative perspective is just smoking weed, doing mushrooms, going on ayahuasca trips, and thinking to themselves, anything that I can think about during these experiences is all I think that matters in history? Do you think that they all think like that? So, is there an extreme that you're sitting on one side or the other? And do you think that as we go through this information, that there may be a little bit more of a balance to be found, less sensationalism, less polarization? I think that that's just a healthy thing for our world in general. Because oftentimes when it comes to most things, there's a balance to be found. Not always. There are absolute truths in this universe, and there's no balance to be found when you're looking at those things. There's right, there's wrong, there's true, there's false. And in those things, there's no room for playing on the fence. You pick a side. There's truth, there's false, there's good, there's evil. Like those are factual foundational realities of the universe that we live in. It's just when it comes to some of these, especially human derived things like how we understand and approach the past, there's a balance to be found there, I think, because the one thing that we know for a fact is that we don't know everything. And so I think that that's a good approach and a kind of a good balance to be found there. So when we're looking at the academic perspective, as we see it today, like the academic approach or somebody writing about the past or thinking about the past, that's not new. Think about Herodotus. There's many historians from the ancient world themselves who would have been a part of what would have been considered quote unquote the academic perspective. What I want to talk about is kind of the university system and scientific means by which we understand the past. And that's going to be something that goes back to the early 1800s or the early 19th century, coming out of German universities. Think Berlin. Humboldt University in Berlin, I think might be a good example, founded in, I think, 1810. But the point is that it was at this place that you had historians like Leopold von Ranke. And, he helped standardize what became kind of the core academic workflow, which is going to involve things like systematic source criticism, which is going to have a heavy use of archives and is going to have a seminar-based training for students to practice research and methods. And Ranke also was closely associated with this German phrase. Now I'm going to try to speak German, so forgive me. But it might be a good laugh for you. But it says, I think, "Wie es eigentlich wissen," and that translated in English is "as it actually happened." So his goal is to create a combination of archival, source criticism, research seminars, and university credentialing is a mechanism for being able to understand the past as it actually happened. And what this did is this kind of gave birth to the beginnings of what we would understand the modern academic approach to history to be. Now, after that initial start, it had a professionalization that has taken place throughout the rest of the 19th and through the 20th century, obviously up to the modern day in the 21st. And so the way that this professionalization kind of took place was through things like universities. And that also gave birth to the development of, the very available for the academic side to be able to use to understand the past. And so, universities, they would have been growing, they would have had increased funding, they would have had volume publications that would have increased, and all of these things would have helped drive subfield specializations. And there's also going to be new source types that come to bear. And there's also going to be new questions being asked. So as these things were developing over the centuries, the ability to have more subfield specializations, field specific methods to be able to study to understand the past began to grow and to grow and to grow. And so what I want to do real quick actually is kind of just to give some credence to that reality of how broad that has become I'm going to read off a list of some of the field specific disciplines that are out there. Now, this list includes, but it's not limited to. So there's going to be more that are out there. And this is going to take me probably at least a minute to get through. So bear with me, but there's a point and there's a reason that I'm taking the time to do it. If you don't want to listen to it, just skip ahead 60 seconds and you'll be pretty much right where I'm going to be carrying on after this. So some of these methods or some of these subfields that exist in the academic community for understanding the past would include things like source criticism, a provenance analysis, contextualization, cooperation and triangulation, chronology building, historiography, paleography, codicology, diplomatics, textual criticism, philology and historical linguistics, discourse and rhetorical analysis, stratigraphy, typology, seriation, context recording, taphonomy, zooarchaeology, archaeobotany, radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, luminescence dating, tephrochronology, isotope analysis, ancient DNA, materials characterization, GIS or spatial analysis, survey archaeology, remote sensing, things like LIDAR, satellite imagery, geophysics. If you've ever heard of the TV show Time Team, which I would recommend to anybody if you want to look at the academic approach, Sir Tony Robbins or Boldrick from the Blackadder is the guy who kind of heads that up, and he's just wonderful. What an awesome guy. And that show is awesome. The archaeologists are so much fun. The academics are a ton of fun. It's really, really a great time, and you get to see the specialization. But the reason I say that is they use geophysics in every single episode of that series. So that's a great example and a great resource if you want to look at the academic approach. There's also things like geoarchaeology, prosopography, network analysis, cliometrics, quantitative history, demographic reconstruction, comparative history, microhistory, oral history interviewing, ethnohistory, memory studies, digital text analysis, database building, and reproducible workflows, digital editions. Like all of those are just examples of the amount of different subfield specializations or field specific methods that can be brought to bear to understand the past. And so the reason I read that list off is that I want to really do justice to conveying just how broad the academic approach to understanding history has become from what would have been the initial creation of these methods, or kind of the creation of history as an academic science in universities in the early 1800s in Germany, to what it has progressed to over those 200 years to what it is now. That I think really helps do justice to show, hey, this is how much this academic approach to the past has grown. And so in that, I think that there's a lot of appreciation to be had for what the academic community brings to bear to be able to understand the past in a verifiable, contextual, data-driven way. And so now what I want to do is look at the alternative approach or what the academics approach would call the pseudo approach. I don't like that term because I think it's demeaning. So I just continue to use the alternative approach. And so from the alternative perspective, it has its origins as well in the 19th century in terms of what we know and understand now. So think Ignatius Donnelly's Atlantis theory, which was an 1882 narrative that would have been outside academic acceptance, a little bit later on in the 19th century than the academic approach in the early 19th century. But the point is that when you're looking at it from, a historical perspective, these two kind of came up together in a way, which would make a lot of sense in terms of having so much history in terms of, venom between the two approaches. But in the 20th century, you have a little bit of that same kind of professionalization, not nearly to the extent that you would have seen from the academic side that I just referenced. But in the 20th century, they did have things like Immanuel Velikovsky's 1950s catastrophic cosmology, which was met with outrage from academics or scientists. There was Eric von Daniken's 1968 Chariots of the Gods, and then Graham Hancock, which many today would be familiar with, had a 1995 book called Fingerprints of the Gods, a book that I've read and it really found to be really fascinating. So from a historical perspective, you have these two approaches kind of coming up together in a way. And so I think that gives weight to the reality of the relationship between the two, which I think that we have seen very clearly demonstrated and, in entertainment and in culture. How is the alternative or the person who looks at the past and it from an alternative perspective, how have they been depicted in entertainment, for instance? Think about Stargate. I'm a huge Stargate fan. And in that, you have Dr. Daniel Jackson, the heart and soul of Stargate SG-1. How is he depicted, though, by James Spader in the original Stargate movie alongside Kurt Russell? He's depicted at the beginning of trying to go in to give the lecture about his view of the pyramids, which falls far outside the academic norm. And so what is the response to him? People walk out, people ignore him. He's kind of confused. He's like, hey, where's everybody going? What's going on here? that alternative historian is being belittled or the academic community is being very cynical towards them. And so I think that kind of victim mentality has really been placed upon the alternative approach. And I think that there's room for that. I think there's a reason for that. And I think that there's a good reason for that at times. However, I also think that that has caused a blanket view of how the academic side is viewed that I don't think is fair at the same time. So what I want to do is transition from the history to the core philosophies of these approaches. So, starting with the academic side, in the end, you're going to have evidence, and that's going to include emphasis like falsifiability, context, source criticism, showing your reasoning chain, transparency, accountability. And really, all of that can be, in essence, summarized up into this very simple quote, which is disciplined curiosity. Now, I want to give a good example of what that looks like in real time. So, it's like, okay, that kind of evidence based, all of those things that I just referenced, what does that look like? And I think a good example of what that could be, what that could look like is in a podcast I recently listened to with Eric Klein, who is a historian, wrote a great book called 1177. And in that book, he talks about the Bronze Age collapse. So you have that Eastern Mediterranean world and the Bronze Age interconnected by trade and commerce and all of these other things. And eventually it collapsed. And one of the reasons they believed it collapsed, or one of the influencing factors, was this people called the Sea Peoples. There's evidence of them in relief carvings in Egypt, especially after Ramses defeated them in battle. But the point is that he was giving an explanation of those Sea Peoples, and one of the things that he talked about was DNA evidence that was found in a Philistine archaeological site showed that a part of the DNA of those remains was Canaanite, which would have been DNA of that geographic area, but the other part of that DNA was other or from elsewhere. And, he presented the hypothesis that this potentially could be evidence of these people being grandchildren of the Sea Peoples, is what he presented. And the reason I say that and how that kind of connects to the core philosophies of the academic approach is that he was emphatic after that, that, hey, even though we have this evidence, even though I think that it may point to this hypothesis being true, what we have is not enough. And that's that disciplined curiosity. It's like, oh, well, this is interesting. The evidence has pointed to this. Now, instead of just saying, oh, we got it. Hey, everybody, look at what we found. It's like, okay, hey, that idea of triangulation that I talked about earlier. Well, let's go ahead and see if we can't find another archaeological site, a Philistine location, that's somewhat in the same region as this, dated to the same time period, and see if we can find some DNA evidence that tells the same story. And then let's maybe see if we can't do it in a third spot. And then you have that kind of triangulation idea of, hey, in this regional area, we have three different archaeological sites, all dated to the same time period, all showing the same evidence. And therefore, I think that we can reasonably come to the conclusion that these are the grandchildren of the Sea People based off of this DNA evidence. And so that, I think, is a great example in real time of what the academic approach looks like when somebody's out there in a platform conveying their findings, but being very disciplined in their curiosity and acknowledging very adamantly that, hey, we're not there yet, but we're moving in the right direction. The evidence is leading us there. We'll see if it takes us all the way. We'll see if it doesn't. Right. I think that that's a great way to kind of consider and look at some of the core philosophies of the way the academics approach the past. Now, one of the things that I think is worth pointing out, earning it, right? So they have these they have these philosophies, these core philosophies that kind of help keep them on the straight and narrow. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring that up is that what the academic approach would consider to be a strength, the alternative approach would look at these core philosophies and not consider them to be a strength. The alternative approach would consider them to be a rigid, dogmatic, I don't know what's the best words for it, rigid, dogmatic, limiting, closed minded, unwillingness to change, in essence, is what they consider these core philosophies to be. And I think that there's no better way of conveying this than from Graham Hancock in a recent podcast that he did with Randall Carlson. And in that podcast, he said the following about the academic community. And he refers to the academics as quackademics, and that is a derogatory term. I just want that to be known that that's how he stated it and that I'm not stating it that way. I'm just quoting him. So he said the following: this very strange psychological problem with quackademia is this core of the old, of the ancient, the desperate desire to do everything possible to keep things as young as possible until the very last moment when the evidence becomes overwhelming that they must absolutely concede that actually things have gotten a lot older. Göbekli Tepe, of course, was one of the big turning stones in that area. But this desperate effort to reduce Atlantis to a Minoan or Mycenaean event that fits into an established timeline Academics defend tooth and nail. Smearing others who offer alternative points of view is just a real problem. It's a real problem in archaeology. It needs a more open-minded approach. And I think that that's wrong. I think that there's always going to be people in certain subsects in any side of the house that's going to be unwilling to change. I think that that's just human nature and human beings. But the reason I say that I would challenge that a little bit is because the academic approach would say that they would be willing to change. However, the means by which they would be willing to change or to be able to be more open minded, what it would take for them to do that is much, much different than what an alternative approach would think about, hey, this should be enough for you to change your mind. And the academic approach would say, hey, that is not even remotely close to enough to get me to change my mind. As a matter of fact, it's not enough to get me to even think about this critically, let alone change my mind. And I think that that's reflective of that because, when you look at the academic approach and what they think about changing things, is this historian Peter Norvig said this, and I'm going to go through like 4 or 5 different quotes from historians talking about their willingness to change. They don't view these core philosophies as infallible. And so these following quotes, I think, give credence to that. And that is that Peter Norvig wrote, historians recognize that complete objectivity is an ideal, not a practical reality. The best we can do is to subject interpretations to critical scrutiny and revise them in light of new evidence. Historian William H. McNeill emphasized historical understanding is always incomplete and subject to revision. There are no final answers, only better or worse questions. Archaeologist Ian Hodder claimed science alone cannot explain why past people did what they did. We must consider symbolism, power, emotion, and belief systems. And historian Richard J. Evans put it that far from being arrogant or dogmatic, academic historians thrive on disagreement. The only certainty is uncertainty. And so the main thing that I wanted to convey is that the alternative approach will oftentimes accuse the academic side of the house of not being willing to change or adapt or anything like that. The academic side would fundamentally disagree with that. It's just the amount of evidence that is needed for somebody to consider something and one road versus the other is astronomically different. And so I think that that's just a good point just to kind of close out this, core philosophy approach of the academic side of the house. And so now what I want to do is just touch briefly on the alternative approach to looking at the past from a core philosophy perspective. Now, the core philosophies of the alternative approach are much, much more difficult to narrow down, right? When you look at the academic approach, the core philosophies are regimented. And the reason they're like that is to ensure that you don't start wandering outside the confines and start allowing personal biases, like I said already, to start influencing things. So the academic approach is by nature very quantifiable, rigid, and structured and easy to understand. The alternative approach is much more nuanced. It's not nearly as easy to narrow down because the whole point of the alternative approach is to be able to be adaptable, to be able to kind of flow, to be able to think outside the box and not find yourself getting pinned down in one certain area, but to be fluid and able to kind of bounce around and see things from a different perspective or a different light. I think that there's a huge strength to be found in that. But the point is that, when we think about the modern idea of alternative history and its approach, you have kind of a non-academic storytelling about the past, but oftentimes it's going to challenge the mainstream scholarly consensus. So that idea of storytelling and that idea of challenging the mainstream narrative of the past, you could kind of consider those to be core philosophies, not so much philosophies in a way of that has to happen, but the reality is that a lot of times it does end up happening. So I guess from a core philosophy perspective, you could kind of add that to the alternative approach. And oftentimes on the alternative side of the house, you're going to have, it's going to be built from myths or anomalies or reinterpretations of existing artifacts. And, there's going to be means by which they do that in the modern day that I think are, in essence, the ways of professionalization of the alternative approach to looking at the past. And I'll get into those a little bit later on. But the point is that inside of the alternative approach, it's much more difficult to narrow down from a core philosophy perspective. But really, one of the core philosophies is that it's very open-minded. It's very willing to think about things in a very different light. It's going to have a lot more fluidity in its structure to being able to be willing to consider certain things, and it's not going to necessitate and require a ton of evidence to be able to give consideration to it. So that, I guess you could say, would be kind of some of the core philosophies, if that makes any sense. There, and again, like I said, I know that those are really general and unspecific almost. They're really open-ended and can go a lot of different ways, but I think that's just the reality of the alternative approach to looking at the past. And, to give such a long-winded explanation of the core philosophies of the academic approach, and then to have much more succinct explanation of the alternative, that's not trying to be biased towards one. That's just, I think, the nature and the reality of the two different approaches, that one's going to make it much more easy to kind of go on a monologue about what it is because it's so regimented and structured, whereas the other one, by nature, is very difficult to narrow and pin down. And I think, like I said, I think that there's value to be seen in both. So that's kind of just a general, very brief kind of presentation of what would be considered, or what I found to be the core philosophies of the alternative approach. And, if somebody would have more of an alternative approach to looking at the past, if that's the road that they've walked down and they spent most of their time, if you think there are quantifiable core philosophies that are associated with that approach, please put it in the comments for people to see, and, add value in that way. And I think that could be beneficial if I'm missing the mark at all on that. Yeah. So now I just want to touch on some of the strengths that I see in both approaches. And so I'm going to start with the academic. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the academic approach, and as I go through these three kind of examples, really in essence, it's kind of saying the same thing in three different ways. But the point is that I think that the rigorous standards that protect against false claims, I think that the self-correcting peer review and scholarly debate, which is another way of rigorous standards, and that these things are very, very positive. Because when I look at these two approaches to the past, one of the things that I appreciate most about the academic approach is that it gives us the verifiable understanding of the past. There's no, oh, I wonder how they did it, or I wonder what this is, or I wonder what that is, and that everybody has their own opinion. Therefore, what do we know? We know nothing, because there's everybody who has this thought of. So the academic approach, it gives us that structured, verifiable way to look at and understand things from the past. When we find a piece of cloth that's been buried in the ground, and that it's the ability of the academic community to take all of those field specific methods, to be able to take those and apply those to an artifact, and to be able to give us all of that verifiable information that then in turn tells us, hey, they were making cloth. And not only were they making cloth, but they were making it like this because these are the patterns of the stitching, which we can look at through a microscope. And because of that, we can also see some of these outlines of the design. So they were designing things on these clothes. We can also see that there's this coloration. And that because of that, we know that they colored the clothes as well. So they had a certain type of coloration on these clothes. And then through all of those different means that we have to come to an understanding of that artifact, all of those questions are filled in. And there's no longer this idea of, oh, well, I wonder if it could have been this or that. It's like, no, this is what it was. And that these things tell us these elements of the way that these people did things. And that is, in my opinion, invaluable. And we have to have that element of the past where we can go back and say, hey, it goes back to that German historian. This is what actually happened. This is how it actually was. And I think that that's a huge benefit. I really do. I just think that when it gets out of balance and it gets to the point to where anything that doesn't look at it from that perspective is wrong and shouldn't be considered, then we start to get into the negatives. And that's something that I'll talk about in the weakness side. But, also the academic approach, it's going to produce robust, well-supported narratives grounded in verifiable data. And that's exactly what I just talked about. And what this does is it gives us that element of certainty to something that is by, its very nature, highly uncertain, which is our understanding of the past. And so I think that that's element of verifiability that the academic approach brings to bear, and that then in turn is supported by that self-correcting peer review scholarly debate through those rigorous standards that are in place to protect against false claims. All of those things, I think, work together to create this process of able to bring a verifiability to the past that is unmatched, that is completely beneficial, and that is wonderful. So on the academic approach, as I kind of look at that in hindsight, I think it's just a lot of repeating myself, which I hate to do because I know that can be annoying to listen to. But the fact of the matter is that I think that all three of those things, even though it's kind of saying the same thing, I think it really does kind of it gives credence to how beneficial all of that is. And, I just think that there's so much to be appreciated there and to be valued there. And so when I think about the strengths of the alternative approach, is just the curiosity that it sparks and the public interest that it generates. And I think that, there's so much value to be taken from understanding the past because, there's so much to be learned. And I think that the fact that the alternative approach is so good at generating that curiosity is a great thing. And there's a reason that it does. Like it's not just in a vacuum. And that's one of the reasons that I think, the alternative approach is such a benefit because there was a study done in 2018 by Chapman University. And in this survey, they were virtually asking Americans about their paranormal beliefs. And one of the things that they did was ask a question about ancient civilizations. And It showed through that survey in 2018 that 56.9% of those that were surveyed believed that an ancient advanced civilization once existed. And so one of the reasons that it's such a strength is because it helps foster that curiosity. And I think that that's a good thing. Now, the academic approach and its response, or at least a portion of the academic approach, has been very hostile to that. Been saying, oh, it's dangerous, it's this or that, and we'll get into that in a minute, which is nonsense. But the point is that there's a reason that that sparks a curiosity, and that's because people understand that there are so many mysteries about the past. And the alternative approach, what it does is it encourages people to apply imagination to considering the past in that way. And I think that that's a very healthy thing because what that necessitates is a worldview. You have to understand your worldview. What do you understand? What are the assumptions that you bring to bear about the reality of the world and the universe in which we live, right? What is your understanding of human beings? Who we are, where we came from, why are we here, who we are in relation to the God that created us. Are you an atheist that doesn't believe that there's a God? So, what are human beings? Why do they operate the way that they do? All of these things are necessary when considering the past from an alternative perspective. All of these things feed into understanding the mysteries of the past. It's like, hey, I don't know the data or the verifiable context and data and information that the academic approach brings to understanding this mystery. But what I do know is that this is a common theme of human beings all throughout history. And so even though we don't have verifiable scientific data, what I do have is my belief and understanding from a worldview perspective of this is the nature of man. And so even though I may not have data to support it, I believe that I know that people would have acted generally in this way because that's just how people are. And so that's one of the huge strengths that I see in the alternative approach is because it forces you to consider your worldview and considering the mysteries of the past and the things that we don't understand and how you would have interpreted the past in that way. And so I see that as a huge approach or a huge positive in their approach. And, again, like I said, that offers they offer an intuitive and an imaginative approach that in the end you have to have when considering human beings. Like I said earlier, there are unquantifiable realities to people. They're not drones. And so how people operate in the past, they're going to be doing things that don't make any logical sense. They're going to be doing things just because. They're going to be building things just because. They're going to be doing things that even though we may not be able to quantify it, doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And so I just think that when you look at it from an alternative approach, like that fills in so many gaps that the academic approach doesn't do. And so in that light, I just see that as a huge strength and benefit from the alternative approach to considering the past. And so now what I want to do is I want to transition to the weaknesses of the academic and the alternative approaches, and then we'll go ahead and wrap this episode up. So weaknesses from an academic perspective is inaccessibility or the technicality that they bring to bear that makes it very difficult for general audiences to understand them. Now, this is not a bad thing in and of itself. These people are operating inside of an industry where the level at which they have to communicate with their peers, the level at which they have to communicate to be able to advance inside of the industry that they're working in is just, they operate at a very high level intellectually, and they have to. And so I can understand how it can be difficult to tone that down. And I can understand how sometimes it may even come across as arrogant and prideful when they do try to tone it down. And so I don't think it's always a negative thing. However, if it gives way to aloofness and pride, I think that that is a bad thing. And that does exist. And a good example of that would be is I was doing some master study and the school that I was at, I remember one time, one of the professors on campus, a published author and was one of the celebrity professors on the campus. I remember one time I was in one of his classes and I tried to stop him. And this isn't a class that has like 300 people in it. You know what I mean? Like these classes have maybe 50 people. So, it's not like, I'm one of 1,000 people trying to stop this guy. I tried to stop him in the hallway to ask him a brief question. And I'll never forget, he did stop and he did look at me, but I'll never forget he had this arrogance of kind of almost a sense of, who are you to stop me in the hallway to ask me a question? And I'll never forget looking at this professor thinking to myself, bro, like, who do you think you are? I remember thinking to myself, like, just because you authored a book and just because you spent, years of your life in a library to try to write it, like, if you think that that puts you in a position to be aloof and arrogant towards me, I'm like, bro, you're living in a different universe and you need to go back to the library and you just need to stay there because, I've got no time for people like you. And the reality is that he is reflective of certainly some in the academic community, no question about it. And those people, I've got no time for people like that. However, I want to caveat that with this. For that one interaction I had with that arrogant professor, I had 10 other interactions with other professors that were positive, that were, these were humble, hardworking, kind, professional people. And if they'd been in a situation where they wouldn't have been able to talk to me, it wouldn't have been an arrogant, aloof, hey, dude, what are you doing type deal. It would have been a, hey, listen, I'm on my way to a lecture right now. I can't talk, but let's go ahead and connect via email and let's get together and have some coffee and let's talk about it. That would have been the response of 10 other of those academic professors. So the reason that I say that is while that aloofness, that arrogance, that kind of inaccessibility of the academic side of the house can exist and does exist, I don't think it exists in its entirety. And I think that that's an example of the balance that I think that needs to be brought to bear when considering the academic approach and its weaknesses. There are some, but also at the same time, it's not a broad blanket covering everybody. And so I think that that's a good example of that. But I think it is a weakness in the academic community that does exist. And so the next one that I want to talk about is just the risk of institutional bias and gatekeeping. And that's, I think, the academic community is not a big one. And being able to grow up in the academic community and advance and grow to become, maybe a tenured professor or to get into one of these field specific methods that, archaeology or, the sciences that are available to looking at the past and wanting to get into one of them and working under a certain professor or trying to work your way to work under a certain professor or a certain school, it can be highly competitive and it can be very difficult to be able to work your way up the ranks. And so when you have, potentially a toxic culture like that, the human nature is going to be to defend your position. The human nature is going to be to want to increase your influence. And especially when you start attaching monetary realities to that, it can be very difficult. And so one of the things that I think, from an institutional bias perspective is that these universities have become, in essence, multi-billion dollar organizations, especially the big ones. And, I don't think it's bad that these universities are challenged constantly. And I think that that's one of the benefits of the alternative approaches. And I didn't really give that as one of its strengths, but I should right now, is that the alternative approach is coming to a place where it's starting to challenge those universities and those people working in those universities to the point where they're actually having to come out of the woodwork to debate people. That is a very good and healthy thing because these big, major, massive institutions like universities, they need to be challenged. They need to be held accountable. They need to be pushed back on. That's a good thing. And so I can appreciate the perspective of, people in the academic community that are trying to work their way up through the ranks inside of these huge bureaucracies and the challenges that that presents. I think also, you think about an academic who's been working for 10, 15, 20 years to try to get to the place that they get so that they can finally get something published or they finally gain a position of influence. And it's taken them years to work their way through that. They've kind of paid their dues, so to speak. And then all of a sudden, you have Graham Hancock who releases a documentary on Netflix or, you have alternative historians or people that are approaching things from an alternative perspective. They release a book and there's millions of people reading their books. And then the monetary benefits of all of those things that come in. And so you have the academics who look at that and you can only imagine the jealousy that probably takes place as a result of that. Of like, dude, I've got to pay all of these dues, work all my way up, all the way to these positions to even be considered to be able to be heard. And then all of a sudden you have what they would call Joe Schmo over there behind his computer screen, recording a video for his YouTube channel and deciding, oh, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and post this. And millions of people are watching what he's posting. And, you can understand how there can be an element of jealousy and gatekeeping that's involved in that, that only heightens and it only increases the intensity of the negative elements or that aloofness that I talk about from the academic perspective. And so I just think that, it's one of those things that if it's not held in check, if it's like, hey, don't get angry at these people for approaching it this way and doing it that way. It's like, hey, guess what? They chose to do it that way. And so could you if you wanted to. Take your expertise from the academic community, take it over, start applying it in the alternative way as well, and kind of bridge the gap between those two and start presenting your own product. Get outside the norm, get outside of that, bureaucracy and start doing things yourself. You can't put that frustration on somebody from the alternative perspective just because you don't like the fact that they haven't had to pay the dues that you've had to pay. And so I think that that's a negative thing in the academic approach. And I think that that's an area that they could benefit to have a little bit more balance. And so lastly, on the weaknesses side for the academic approach, what I wanted to do is I wanted to touch on their response to Graham Hancock and his Ancient Apocalypse series. And I think that, I don't know if this is indicative of the whole of academia. I don't know if this is a small group inside of academia, but I think that their response to the Ancient Apocalypse series, specifically the first season, I think that their response was, I don't even know how to describe it, beyond toxic, insane, maybe even might be the way to describe it. But what I want to do is the Society of American Archaeology, what they did is they wrote an open letter to Netflix, who aired the Ancient Apocalypse series. And they wrote a letter because it was being aired as a docu-series, and they believed that it should not be aired with that label. It should be aired with the label of science fiction. And so what they did is they wrote an open letter to Netflix to try to discourage them from giving it that label, and they wanted him to change that label. And this is pretty unprecedented for an academic institution or an academic organization to send an open letter to an entertainment company to try to get them to change the label on a series. Because in doing that, they're interacting with the alternative approach in the way that they've never done in the past. You don't even give credence to it by even talking about it. And so the fact that they sent this letter really is a significant event. But the main thing is what they said in the letter, I think, is a huge weakness of the academic approach, or to a minority in the academic approach. I don't know if it's a minority or majority. I sure hope it's a minority. So I'm just going to err on the side of being positive and saying that it's likely a minority. But inside this letter, they said this. They said these things about Ancient Apocalypse in the first season to try to get it changed from a docuseries to science fiction. And so they said, contrary to Hancock's claims, archaeology does not willfully ignore credible evidence, nor does it seek to suppress it in a conspiratorial fashion. The letter continues. The assertions Hancock makes have a history of promoting dangerous racist thinking. His claim for an advanced global civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by comets is not new. This theory has been presented, debated, and refuted for at least 140 years. The theory steals credit from indigenous accomplishments and indigenous peoples and reinforces white supremacy. Hancock's narrative emboldens extreme voices that misrepresent archaeological knowledge in order to spread false historical narratives that are overtly misogynistic, chauvinistic, racist, and anti Semitic. They also claim, this is not a part of the quote, but they also claim in the letter that the show's foundational theory had longstanding association with racist or white supremacist ideologies. And like I said earlier, they said that it does injustice to the indigenous peoples of those areas that Graham Hancock is making claims about. And when I read this, I was in my research, I was flabbergasted. Because, so if they had said this, if they said, "Hey, we want to change this from a docuseries to a science fiction series," and they said, "Hey, listen, the assertions made by Hancock, of an advanced global civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by comets isn't new. This series has been presented, debated, and it's been refuted for over 140 years. So can we try to change this to a science fiction series?" Like, even if they had sent that, I still wouldn't agree with it. I wouldn't like it, but that's like, okay, like, I get it. They're trying to say, hey, this has been refuted historically by all of these different methods that we have to bear. Can you guys change this to, science fiction? It's like, okay, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at all of these other things that they claimed about the series, dangerous, racist, white supremacist, and like chauvinistic, misogynistic, anti-Semitic, first and foremost, none of those things have anything to do with changing the label. None of those have any bearing on it. All of those are just simply words that were used by those who wrote this letter as a means to create pressure to try to force and generate the change in the outcome they were looking to get to. That's all that is. That's like, hey, if we use these words, especially in the time in which it was written, this is going to generate potentially enough pressure that they are going to be forced to, in essence, canceling. It's almost like a reverse canceling attempt. Instead of Graham Hancock having said things that would require them to, hey, we got to turn this guy off because he said these things, they are virtually trying to attribute these things to him to in turn force Netflix to turn him off or cancel him. That is what's happening right here. And it's absolute nonsense. Like, I'm trying to not be sensational, but this is one of those true versus false situations where you have to just take a side. And the fact of the matter is that I have listened to hours of Graham Hancock do presentations. I have listened to hours of Graham Hancock and, listening to his book, The Fingerprints of the Gods. I have listened to and watched every single second of the first season of Ancient Apocalypse. And listen, when I'm talking about Graham Hancock, if you listen to one of his lectures or one of his presentations on Gnosticism, he talks about the Abrahamic faith, of which me as a Christian, I am a part of one of those Abrahamic faiths as a follower of Jesus Christ. That man is no friend to my worldview. He is no friend to the Christian faith. Like, that's a fact. But I'll also say this is a fact. I've watched and listened to a lot of things that that gentleman has said. There is not a racist bone in that man's body. There is nothing that he has ever said that has demeaned an indigenous civilization. As a matter of fact, if you listen to what he talks about and how he talks about these indigenous civilizations, he is one of the biggest promoters of those indigenous civilizations. He loves these people that he goes and interacts with in all of these different cultures, and he celebrates their cultures. He celebrates their way of life. He celebrates their contributions historically to the world and to their own nation. He has never done anything that has ever demeaned an indigenous peoples. And lastly, on this, I, like I said, watched every single second of the first season of Ancient Apocalypse. And if you watch that season, there is absolutely nothing that you can take away from that series that would in any way, shape, or form give credence to, support to, or acknowledge something like racism, white supremacy, anti Semitism, chauvinism, misogyny, any of those things. There is nothing in that series that could ever be portrayed or be interpreted in that way. The only way that you could ever do that is by coming into it saying, we are going to add these things to this, and we're going to look at anything we can in any way we can to try to twist it and contort it to our own ends. Literally, it is a portion of the academic community acting in a way that is completely against their typical approach. What do they say? You don't have an outcome that you want, and then you twist the evidence to make that outcome a reality. That is exactly what they did here. They wanted it to be the reality that this would be considered racist or white supremacist or misogynistic, chauvinistic, whatever. They were like, that's what we want it to be. And therefore, we're going to go ahead and we're going to twist this to make it so. Okay? And they are literally doing exactly what they claim the alternative approach to looking at the past does, and they think it's wrong. They're doing the exact same thing. And when I saw this letter from the SAA in response to an alternative approach to looking at the past, that is a huge weakness. Now, I like to think the best of people, and I like to think that this is a minority of the academic community. And I personally believe that it is. I sure hope it is, because if I'm wrong, it's bad. But the fact of the matter is that I think it's a minority, and I think that this minority is wrong. I think that they have no place to present these things, because what they're doing is they're not making claims to try to get people to kind of try to change a label. They are assaulting and they are attacking a man's integrity. They are assaulting and they are attacking a man's morality. And there is no place for that. A few hundred years ago, you would find yourself dueling with somebody for saying the things that these people are saying about this man. And it is wrong. And I would just very vehemently stand alongside Graham Hancock on this and say that these people are wrong. They need to be told they're wrong. And they need to, they would never issue an apology. But I tell you what, you could not find a situation where an apology would be more needed and more necessary. And so if you're going to write an open letter like that and you're going to make claims like that, what do they talk about on the academic side? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, they made an extraordinary claim and they did not have extraordinary evidence. And so I think that they need to be called out for that. And for the 25 people that listen to my podcast, like they're at least going to hear that from me. And I think that that's a good thing and people need to hear it. So looking at the alternative approach when it comes to weaknesses, I've actually already hinted at this, is that I think that the alternative approach can put a broad blanket that covers everybody in the academic community as a cynic, as reflective of the people that wrote that open letter from the Society of American Archaeology to Netflix. I think that the alternative approach can look at everybody in the academic community in that light. And I don't think that that's a good thing. I think that that's a weakness, because I think that there's a lot of really good, really balanced, really well-meaning people on the academic side of the house. I really do. It's like I said earlier, I had that experience with that one professor, but the other professors that I interacted with, the other 10 were awesome. And they were good people. They were kind people. They were hardworking people. They were diligent. And I think that there's so many people on the academic side of the house that get pulled underneath this cynical look at the academic side that aren't like that. And I think that it's not good for the alternative approach to look at things like that. However, it's so easy for me to say that. Think about Graham Hancock. It's not like he's just thrown these ideas out willy-nilly. He's traveled the world. He has been to, dozens of different cultures, dozens of different sites. He has looked at these things, studied these things, looked at the astronomy and all of these connected things. He has invested decades of his life into these things. This isn't somebody who just decided all of a sudden after he did mushrooms that, I'm just going to say that. Like, this is a man who has dedicated years of his life, has done hard work. And he has come to these conclusions and he has presented these hypotheses, and he has been, like I just talked about, ruthlessly attacked. And so I think about that quote earlier when he said quackademia. This isn't done in a vacuum. This is a man who has been assaulted verbally and attacked to his very core and his integrity and his morality, like the SAA did to Netflix. I can understand how he could look at the academic community in that way. However, this is where a worldview comes into play. And I think that there's always room for grace. And I think that there has to be an understanding that not everybody in the academic community is like that. And I have a genuine understanding of how Graham Hancock could look at things in that light, and some of the others on the alternative side of the house. I can understand how that can be there. However, I would encourage anybody who has that alternative approach, who has been treated like that, try to give a little bit of grace to understand that not everybody's like that. Not everybody on the academic side of the house is going to act as insanely as those did who wrote that letter to Netflix from the SAA. And so another thing when I think about weaknesses from the alternative approach is that lack of verifiable evidence, right, that they present. Because what they do is a lot of the times on the alternative approach, they'll present a thesis where it's not falsifiable. You can't prove it wrong, but you also can't prove it right. And that's what something that is unknown or a mystery is. You can't prove a mystery. And so while it is while it's also a strength, I think it's also partially a weakness because being able to bring some element of evidence, being able to bring some element of, hey, we don't know, it's not going to fill in all the blanks, but there's these things that kind of make it seem like it might make sense. And that's one of the things that I think Graham Hancock has done so well. I think about somebody like Uncharted X and Ben Van Kirk. What he does is he talks to, he looks at a lot of things from different types of stone, granite, diorite, these different types of stone and their different hardnesses. And then he looks at some of the artifacts that we have specifically from ancient Egypt. And he goes out and he talks to modern experts, people that work on granite, people that work on diorite, and they do it in the modern day. And he's like, hey, this is what we understand as having been done in the past to move these things or to chisel these things. This is what the current historical understanding is of how they work these things. Does that make any sense? And a lot of the times these experts will be like, there's absolutely no freaking way that happened. And so that I think is a really cool way of adding a little bit of evidence, a little bit of substance to their claim. And so I think that that's a part of the professionalization. However, I still think that there's a lot of alternative approaches that don't have any element of that at all. And so if you're approaching things and you're just kind of throwing out willy-nilly thoughts and ideas of what the past could have been, and there's no hard work, there's no substance behind that claim at all to try to give some weight and some genuine thought to it. It's just, hey, I was doing ayahuasca or I had a mushroom trip and I decided that, hey, I had this, interdimensional experience and I think that it's awesome. It's like, okay, well, that's all well and good, but, put in a little bit of work to kind of come to some element of substance to give credence to what you're saying before you start talking about how it's a world timeline changing reality that you've come to. I think that can be a weakness on the alternative side of the house. But I think, like I said, there's been some professionalization of that in that area that I think is improving. And so that's going to kind of conclude the weaknesses of how I look at the alternative approach. And, and just in conclusion to this episode, and that's going to be the last thing that I talk about is just, I just want to ask the questions, what kind of evidence do you think is necessary to change our understanding of history? How would you weigh the importance of imagination versus verification? How would you answer those questions? Is I present the reality of, hey, there's two roads to looking at the past that we kind of see right now in our world. What road do you think is better? Do you think there's one that's better than the other? Or do you think that they're mutually beneficial? Does those work together to give the best and potentially the most holistic approach to looking at history and seeing the past in the most beneficial and balanced light? That's my belief. I think that they work together in a way to where even though these two different camps kind of vehemently can't stand each other, for me on the outside looking in, I can take the work of the academics and I can take some of the thoughts and the ideas of those who look at things alternatively. And I feel like as I look at them, I'm getting the best and most holistic view of looking at the past. And so I've been benefited by both. So from my perspective, I say thank you to both. I say thank you to the Graham Hancocks, to the Randall Carlsons, to the Ben Van Kirks. I say thank you to all the academics out there who do all that hard work and spend all of that time, on archaeological digs down there with their trowels and with their paintbrushes, painstakingly going layer by layer by layer through the dirt, going through and archiving everything, marking everything in its spot, looking at the context, and then applying all of those field-specific methods. I kind of get excited talking about it, so I'm sorry if I'm kind of, being a little too intense, but I just appreciate them. I appreciate the academic approach. I appreciate the painstaking, detailed work that they do. And so, for me, it's not a kumbaya, let's all get together and get along type deal. It's I genuinely see value in both. But what about you? Do you see value in both? Do you not? What do you think? I think it's worth considering. And so if you've taken the time to have a listen today, I thank you. And I hope it's been entertaining, beneficial to you, and educative. And, even though I can attack topics that have some difficult elements to them, in the end, I hope it's a benefit and encouragement to you. And so, again, wherever you are today, I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you on the next episode. So take care. Thanks. Bye.